Welcome back to our podcast. I'm Dale Rude, and this time we'll be talking about Unraveling the Revelation, Part 11. It came to my attention by one of the subscribers to the podcast that there was an abrupt end to our last episode. As I looked at what had been recorded, I realized that there were some missing charts. So today I would like to cover those charts and add a few more to those before we proceed further in our investigation. This chart here is a chart that's found in some of the older Sixth Seal books, and what it shows is that on the left-hand side it portrays a picture of the morning time church, or the church that we read about in the book of Acts in the New Testament. Brother Warner labeled this the morning light. As you can see there, it shows the mountain, which identified as Mount Zion. In the second phase of this chart is a picture of the Roman Catholic Church, portrayed by a mountain as well. And it shows that there had been a great apostasy and there had been a time of darkness, commonly referred to as the Dark Ages. In the third section, there's a representation of Protestantism, or what they call the cloudy day. And sometimes it's noted as the dark and cloudy day, meaning that there were still things that were not understood, and there were some things that were not quite clear, and so it was kind of like a cloudy time. This was when there was development of sectism and many denominations. And you can see those showed there at the bottom, and they would often refer to these as the hills of Babylon. In the fourth section, it showed a returning back to the purity of the morning time church. In this instance, it was called the evening light, and it was basically a return back to Mount Zion, which would include a coming out of all man-made religious organizations and a gathering to the one true church, the Church of God. Now, after the seventh seal message and the belief that the Church of God Reformation movement had gone into apostasy, they changed the chart, and it looks something like this. Over on the left-hand side, you still see Mount Zion. The second phase is the Roman Catholic Church. You see that there. And there also is the inclusion of the Greek Orthodox Church, which was not discussed too much in the earlier writings, and it's shown as a hill, if you will. And then there's the traditional Protestant denominations and sectism. So up until this point, everything is still the same, except for it does have the addition of the Greek Orthodox there. And then finally, on the far right-hand side, we see again Mount Zion restored to the condition that existed even in the New Testament, Mount Zion. But there's also a new hill there, and that is the Church of God Anderson. So rather than the Church of God movement being that Mount Zion that at one time represented, now it was believed that it had gone into apostasy and that there was a come-out message for them as well. And you can see the year 1930 at the bottom. So these are the charts that started circulating, and they kind of represent the two schools of thought. Now, what I would like to do very quickly is just look at some new information that was included on the timeline of the seventh seal. So for the first time, it included the 7 church ages, and they corresponded, those 7 church ages, to the 7 churches that we read about in Revelation, the 2nd and 3rd chapter. They believe that these church ages represented sequential epochs of time, or church ages, that would come into being from the time of the birth of the church until the second coming of Christ. So there were some additional dates that were included on the 7 seal charts, namely 530 AD, 1730 AD, 1930 AD, and 1980 AD. So from 530 to 1530 AD was the 10 prophetic days of the Dark Ages, which are mentioned in Revelation, the 2nd chapter, and verse number 10. And this is included in the letter to the church in Smyrna, or actually that second church age, although they did apply those 10 prophetic days to the third period of time, and we're going to talk about that later on. And while in Goodnight's original line chart that I'm going to show here in the next slide, 1730 is not listed as a year on the chart, but there is information within the context of the book that talks about John Wesley and about his church age, if you will. So there is a tick mark. It's just not, the letters are not there. Now in the picture charts, they did include that date on there. And of course now they're that date is pretty much on every one of the 7 seal charts. And we talked quite a bit so far about 1930. And 1930 was believed to be the end of the 6th seal and the beginning of the 7th seal. And it was taught that the 7th seal would end in 1980, and the saints by that point would be gathered into one visible body. And then there was an introduction of a new, it wasn't called an epoch of time, but a new period of time shortly after 1980 that was defined as being the camp of the saints. Now this was much different, and this is actually not taught this way today among the 7 seal. So basically they use the hour symbol to describe its length of time, this time of the camp of the saints. They believe that a half-hour silence was placed at the end of the 7th seal rather than the beginning. You can find that on page 123 of Goodnight's 1933 book. And it says this: "In this we are made to believe we shall come to time at the end of the 7th seal, that there will be no rejoicing in heaven, for no one is being saved." So this period of silence here today is taught that was at the beginning of the 7th seal. Goodnight, in his first book, taught that this half hour of silence was actually at the end of the 7th seal. Okay? Now we're going to talk about this in more detail as we go along. Here's the chart I was just referring to. This is, again, the first chart, 7 seal chart that was found in Goodnight's book, the 1933 book. And you can see across the top these dates. So we have on the far left-hand side, we have the beginning of the church age in general, so AD 33, although it doesn't have 33 on there, but this was implied. And then there was 270 years, and then there was a gap of 260 years between the year 270 and 530. And then there was the 1,000 years between 530 and 1530. Then there was 350 years between 1530 and 1880. And then there was this 100 years that would happen sometime after 1880 and into 1980, at which time there would be what was called the Camp of the Saints. And we discussed about what the Goodnight believed the eighth beast would be, and how that they would surround the saints and so forth, and then Christ would come back right when it looked like it was getting something major was getting ready to happen. Okay, you see some other dates on there as well. You see the year 364, the year 606, the year 1281. Okay. So what actually happened in 1880? Well, what had been taught was that communism or atheism was going to combine with all false holiness churches and Babylon, which included Protestantism and Catholicism, and that they would surround the camp of the saints, and they would do harm, in fact even kill some of the saints, and they would do harm, and right when it was getting ready to be at its worst, Jesus would come back, and that would be the end of all things. Well, in 1980, actually, we had President Ronald Reagan, and he was a pretty popular president. He played a key role in ending the Cold War, and citizens of Eastern Europe who rejected communism regimes, instead of it growing, it actually decreased. Mr. Gorbachev, we all remember that statement that President Reagan said to him. He said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear this wall down," the wall that divided East and West Germany. And ultimately, the Soviet Union, that union that was governed by communism, a communist union, it collapsed ultimately on December the 26th of 1991. So not only did the prophecy not come true from a spiritual perspective, it also did not come true in regard to communism and world events. Okay, let me show you a chart I put together. And this is a chart I created to kind of show where there's overlap between the 6 seal chart and the 7 seal chart. So at the top, we've all seen the charts that were put together by the early brethren showing the 4 time periods. From AD 33 to 230, it was the age of paganism, and it was the first epoch of time, and they called it the morning time. The second period of time was from 270 to 1530, a time of papalism, and a time in which was a very dark age. In fact, your history books obviously talk much about the Dark Ages. And then from 1530 to 1880 was the development of Protestantism, which they labeled the Cloudy Day. And then finally, from 1880 until the end of time, no date there, was what they referred to as the evening light, in which the message of holiness, unity, justification, sanctification, and a number of other doctrines played a role, and the overall message was that every Christian should come out of these man-made systems and come into the freedom of the Church of God. Okay, now at the bottom you can still see that those 4 church ages are still shown. So this wasn't a radical change to the message, but it did add some new dates. So basically what it did is the first period of time remained the same. The period of time between 270 and 1530 was broken up, and there was an additional added date there of 530. So now by 1530, instead of having 2 epochs of time, you now had 3 epochs of time. And then in what had been the 3rd church age, from 1530 to 1880, they added another date there, and that was the focus of on holiness as presented by the Wesley brothers, And the date there was described as being 1730. So at this point, instead of 3 church ages, now we have 5 church ages. And then finally, in the last, what had been the last epoch of time, called the Evening Light, they divided that up into 2 church ages and added the date of 1930. And 1930 being when the Church of God Reformation had gone into apostasy. So you have all 7 church ages at the bottom, which were built upon the previous teachings, which we see at the top. Okay, so I wanted to point that out. And then, yes, there is the 1980 date at the bottom, which was said to be, the end of time or shortly thereabouts. So let me just kind of reiterate that again. W.S. Goodnight used D.S. Warner's timeline as the foundation of the new 7th Seal timeline. And we see some, the dates that were the same as the previous explanation. So we see, again, 33, 270, 1530, and 1880. But Goodnight added 3 additional epochs of time, which and to do that, you had to have 4 new dates, or at least 3 new dates, plus the end of time. So you had 530, you had 1730, 1930, and 1980. Okay, now I pointed out a few other dates that were on Goodnight's chart. Those dates were taken from Clarence Larkin's book titled Dispensational Truth or God's Plan and Purpose in the Ages. Now those dates that he used from that particular line of thought was 1491, 490 BC, 364 AD, and 606 AD. So it was kind of a combination of a number of things that was going on there. Okay, so this was a change, right? We know that. We recognize that. Well, I always had wondered, what did F.G. Smith think about this? Because he was around during this time. I'm sure he had been exposed to this. What did the brethren there that were still laboring within the Anderson Reformation movement, how did they view this? And I never really got an answer, because that book that Brother Goodnight published in 1933, it was published by Warner Press, and it has the Warner Press trademark in it. So when I read that book, I'm like, what? I can't believe this. These people are going to publish this book when it's denouncing them? It didn't make sense to me. Until I was doing some research and I found the following. So this was a letter that was written to Brother C.E. Brown, who at that time was the editor of the Gospel Trumpet paper. And this is what it says. This is in 1933, actually. Okay. Here's what it says. I have long been a reader of the Gospel Trumpet and of the doctrinal books published by the Gospel Trumpet Company. I am a believer in these teachings, but I have been disturbed lately by a book titled Chart Explanation of the Revelation by W.S. Goodnight. For the book itself says, printed for the author by the Warner Press, Anderson, Indiana, A.D. 33. They go on to say, this book apparently discards definite applications of symbols, which is strongly stressed in your books, and applies them indiscriminately without system or order. To my mind, the book is wholly out of harmony with our former teachings on prophecy in methods and in results. The author chops the present-day Reformation up into 3 parts, making a sort of new Reformation and new light due in 1930, and another section, quote unquote, Camp of the Saints, not to come until 1980. All this does not harmonize with our published works. And he goes on to say, since this book bears the imprint of our press in Anderson, I should like to know, and I believe the Gospel Trumpet readers are entitled to know, your answer to the following questions. Number 1, are we to understand that the Gospel Trumpet Company is responsible for this book? And the editor says no. Number 2, did our publication committee pass upon and approve its doctrines and prophetic interpretations before the press printed it? And Brother Brown stated no. Number 3, has the Gospel Trumpet Company, through its committees or otherwise, sanctioned the contents of the book since it was printed? And the answer Brother Brown provided was no. And this was submitted by, quote unquote, an interested Gospel Trumpet reader. Okay, C.E. Brown, the editor, then goes on and responds and says the following. This is on page 9 of the Gospel Trumpet, October 27th, 1994. Quote, the manuscript for the above-mentioned book, referring to Goodnight's book, was submitted by the author to our editorial department and rejected by us because we strongly disapproved of it. Later, the author had it printed by our commercial printing department as a job of commercial printing, for which he paid the regular price, the same as any other job of printing. Our commercial printing department will do any kind of job printing provided it is not immoral, the same as any other high-class plant. The editor wishes to emphasize that this book does not represent our belief, but only that of the author. So when I read that, I realized, okay, I now, I understand that. So that's why, even though it has the stamp Warner Press in it, it was not sanctioned by the powers that be there in Anderson, Indiana. In fact, it didn't go through the review committee or anything. So basically what Brother Goodnight did was he submitted to them just simply to have them print it up. Now that's not uncommon with printing companies, even those that are related to religious activities. And in fact, the Gospel Trumpet would print up a lot of different things that were print jobs, so to speak, that were sent to them. And that helped them keep the costs down of the other material that they did sanction. Some years ago, I put this chart together that represents schisms and splits that have taken place in the Church of God Reformation movement over the years, beginning in 1880 and ending in 2003. I quit updating this chart in 2003. Since that time, there have been a number of additional splits, particularly among the Seventh Seal advocates. Now, I show this chart on here because the boxes represent groups or smaller schisms that have taken place. And the boxes in lavender color represent those individuals and those groups that still hold to the teachings of D.S. Warner and F.G. Smith with regard to the number of church ages that they taught. So, for instance, those in purple would still believe that there are 4 church ages. Those boxes that represent the 7 seal advocates are in the orange color, and they would believe in the church age being divided up into 7 epochs of time rather than 4. Now, if you talk to someone whose box is represented by the lavender color, and you refer to them as 6th seal, they may not even realize what you're talking about, because they do not refer to themselves as 6th seal. That was just language that was not used very frequently back in those days. But in the 7th seal movements, they would refer to those in lavender as 6th seal. And so I just wanted to show this chart to give you a feeling for how the breakout may look like with regard to 6th seal and 7th seal advocates. Now, I want to take a real quick look at these dates again. So what I have done here is I've color-coded them. The dates that are and the events that are associated with the 6th seal, or those teachings of D.S. Warner, are in blue. The dates and the events associated with the 7th seal are in green. So again, you can see that 7th seal is still using the dates of the 6th seal, but they've added these additional things. And so I've already gone through this, but I do want to go through this a little bit more. And we're going to spend, in our next episode, we're going to spend quite a bit of time breaking each one of these down. So let me just run through this list here, because I would like for you to ask yourself some questions about these. So the first date on the charts, AD 33, represents Christ's burial and resurrection, death, burial, and resurrection. Represents the day of Pentecost and the bringing in of the church, and also a spiritual earthquake that happened at that time. We read about that in New Testament scripture. AD 270, we label it the beginning of the apostasy of the church. That's a 6th seal teaching, and it's held by the 7th seal as well. Now, AD 530, that is the end of the pagan power and the beginning of the papal power. So there was this apostasy, but then there was this empowerment that took place. And that we had the date on our charts of 530 for that, 7th seal. 1530, it's on both charts, and it represents the exclusivity of papal Rome and how it had come to an end. The beginning of Protestantism, and the Lutheran era, or justification by faith. Some of the Church of God groups will talk about the 3 pillars: justification, sanctification, and unity. Well, this is the first of those pillars, justification by faith. 7th seal churches hold 1730 on their charts as a major milestone, and that is the beginning of the Wesley era, or the teaching of sanctification and holiness being restored. That's a 7th seal date. 1880, 6th seal and 7th seal, the beginning of the evening light era, the beginning of the Church of God Reformation movement, at which time it's believed that there was a second spiritual earthquake that took place. And then the last 2 dates are exclusively in 7th seal teaching, and that's 1930, the beginning of the 7th seal message. The silence is broken, and again, that's different than what Brother Goodnight taught. He put that at the end of the 7th seal, but the advocates of 7th seal today actually had that at the beginning of the 7th seal. Unity is restored, and a spiritual earthquake is to have taken place shortly after. And then we have this date that we spent some time talking about, 1980. was believed to be the end of the seventh seal and the beginning of the camp of the saints, which then would be very shortly followed by Christ's imminent return. So what I would like for you to do in preparation for our next podcast, I would like for you to ask yourselves the following questions. Looking forward. Now remember, this whole book is about prophecy. Prophecy is not about looking backwards, it's about looking forward. So we shouldn't have to go backwards in time to find dates or to make sense of this. When God shows us something in prophecy, it's something that's supposed to happen in the future that he reveals to us so we will understand what's happening when it happens. So I would like for you to ask yourselves, looking forward from each milestone year, what symbols of time is used to reach the next milestone? If these are prophecy and we say that we get all of our symbols, the interpretation of those are found somewhere in the Bible, what symbols of time is used to get from one milestone to the next? Second question I'd like for you to ask yourself, what historical event was prophesied in the Old Testament or New Testament to happen in each year? When we go back to the book of Daniel and we read about Daniel's 70 weeks, when that prophecy was given, it was so exact that some people have looked at it and got those dates down to like the month. So it wasn't just about what year they were going to happen. It was what time of the year they were going to happen. So God is very detailed when he gives these prophecies. So I'm asking you to look at what historical event was prophesied in the Old Testament or New Testament to happen for each year. What happened in each milestone year, third question on the Revelation chart, that was significant enough to mark it as a milestone year? You know, I told you when I had to answer that question to Brother Ron, when I started talking about one of the editors at the Gospel Trumpet over in Anderson got voted out as the editor of their paper, and another one got voted in. That's not a major milestone worldwide. It's not something that's significant. We may see it as significant, as what it may have represented, but on a worldwide scale, that's not a significant event. So I'm asking you to look at what significant event happened to mark each of those milestone years. Fourth question, in what secular history literature do we find each year listed as a major milestone in church history? For instance, we know what happened in AD 33, the day of Pentecost. You know, Christ, we know that, and even in our secular writings. We know that from Scripture, but we also know it in secular writings. So if I were to go pick up a very detailed church history book somewhere, I would expect to see events in that history book that happened during those years that we have on our charts. Okay, last question. In what Church of God writing do we see each milestone year, and who was the author of that line of thought? Okay, 5 questions. I'd like for you to ask yourself that question, because as we go through these timelines and these specific years, I would like for us to, have those in mind so that we can determine whether or not our timeline chart is accurate. That's a fair question. That's a fair thing to do. If something is truth, it should stand up to scrutiny. Otherwise, it's not, most likely not truth. So we should be able to explain these things to individuals and explain it in sufficient detail that they get a good understanding. So that's all I have to share in this episode. Thank you for your time, and look forward to our next podcast.